To capture an image, there is one thing you absolutely need: light. In the previous episodes of the exposure triangle, we learned how the aperture controls the amount of light let into the camera, and that ISO controls the gain or amplitude of the light. But there is one last mechanism involved: the shutter. But light isn't the only thing the shutter affects. It also plays a big role in how motion is captured. And not all motion looks the same. So, how does an image maker use the shutter to control light and motion? This is what is shutter speed. So what is shutter speed and how does it work? Along with aperture and ISO, shutter speed is part of the exposure triangle. To understand this, let's recap how a camera captures light. Light enters the lens and passes through the aperture and lands on the film stock or digital sensor to create an image. In between the lens and the sensor is a barrier known as the shutter. The shutter's job is to block light from the sensor. The shutter opens for a predetermined amount of time before shutting. This repeats many times per second. The amount of time the shutter is open is known as the shutter speed, which is usually measured in fractions of a second. For example, a shutter speed of 1/50th lets in light for 1/50th of 1 second. The two direct effects of shutter speed are exposure and motion blur. First, let's talk about exposure. The shutter controls how long the frame is exposed to light. The slower the shutter, the longer the frame is exposed to light, resulting in a brighter image. The faster the shutter, the less light reaches the frame, resulting in a darker image.
This is a lot to process.
Now, I know this is a lot of information to digest. So, for a complete breakdown of the nuts and bolts, such as mechanical versus digital shutters, rolling versus global shutter, and the role of shutter angle, be sure to check out our companion article that will take you through this step by step.
Next most commonly used angle, 180 degrees. Now when I spin this, you can very clearly see that we're now getting half the exposure that we did before.
But for now, we will focus primarily on the different visual effects of shutter speed. Now, the function of shutter speed in the exposure process is straightforward. But how it affects motion is a little more complicated.
See, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curve.
Every motion picture contains some level of motion blur. Faster shutter speeds reduce motion blur, while slower shutter speeds increase motion blur. The most cinematic shutter speed for film and video is found using the 180-degree shutter rule. The 180-degree shutter rule says the shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be set to 1/48th, and so on. But why this ratio? For most of cinematic history, starting in the late 1920s, the industry standard for film has been 24 frames per second, with a shutter angle at 180 degrees. This remained unchanged for decades. Over time, we've become accustomed to this amount of motion blur. It's just what movies are supposed to look like.
You look terrible.
It's only when filmmakers deviate from this 180-degree shutter rule that we even notice the motion blur. So, let's take a look at how and why cinematographers use various shutter speeds for different effects. Starting with slow shutter speeds, anything set above 180 degrees. A slow shutter creates more motion blur, which has unique storytelling effects. For example, through a traumatic flashback.
They come to his home in the afternoon looking for his business. They find his wife and kids in the house and decide to wait for Soze.
In The Usual Suspects, cinematographer Newton Thomas Sigel shot this scene at 6 frames per second and a wide-open shutter. When played back at 24 frames per second, we see this motion as stuttering with a lot of smearing from the open shutter.
He lets the last Hungarian go. He waits until his wife and kids are in the ground, and then he goes after the rest of the mob.
John! Are you f***ing high?
This was also used in The Wolf of Wall Street, as Jordan starts tripping on Quaaludes. Director of photography Rodrigo Prieto used a 360-degree shutter angle at 12 frames per second to increase the motion blur of the image.
Pow! I mean, I had skipped the tingle phase and went straight to the drool phase.
Tell me where you are. Don't
These little bastards were so strong, I discovered a whole new phase, the cerebral palsy phase.
However, if you're shooting at higher frame rates, the 180-degree shutter rule applies less. The Hobbit was famously shot at 48 frames per second, but needed a 270-degree shutter to compensate for a more natural motion blur.
I shall inform the others.
Inform the who? What? No, wait. We do not want any adventures here. Thank you. Not today.
Another reason to use a slow shutter speed is for long exposure shots. We've been talking about shutter speed in fractions of a second, but long exposures can last for minutes at a time. Picasso actually experimented with what are called light drawings by using a small light and a slow shutter. Slower shutter speeds can be a creative way to capture highly stylized shots. On the opposite end, eliminating motion blur has its own unique applications. This is done with a fast shutter speed, anything below 180 degrees. A faster shutter speed reduces the amount of motion blur, making the video appear jittery or hyper-realistic. Cinematographers use fast shutter speed stylistically to amplify intensity or realism. This is commonly used in scenes with a lot of action, often coupled with a handheld camera. Janusz Kaminski, famed cinematographer of Saving Private Ryan, refers to this effect as staccato. Kaminski shot these sequences with either a 45 or 90-degree shutter. This extreme lack of blur means we can see individual dirt particles in the air. Creating a frenzied and chaotic visual experience. Kaminski also used the shutter for a different effect. By offsetting the timing of the shutter so that light hits the frame while it's moving, he was able to create these vertical streaking highlights. A technique he borrowed from Full Metal Jacket and used again in Minority Report. As we've discussed, there are certain filmmaking rules when it comes to using shutter speed to create a cinematic look. However, some of the best cinematographers break those rules to create something new. Mastering shutter speed and the exposure triangle as a whole will give you the tools necessary to best tell your story. And if you haven't yet, make sure to download our free ebook, Exposure, the Ultimate Guide, which breaks down the practical lighting scenarios and how each of the 3 settings work in combination. In the next episode of our exposure series, we'll put the entire exposure triangle to the test with a look at real-world scenarios and how to adjust your aperture, ISO, and shutter. What other shutter speed techniques are there? Share your favorites in the comments.